I pulled into David's driveway at 5:45. The house was already full. I could see it through the windows. People moving, the warm blur of bodies behind glass. Vanessa had put lanterns along the walkway, the kind you buy in bulk. They flickered unevenly, and I remember thinking they should have used LED candles instead. Steadier, more reliable. I sat in the car for a minute. Maybe two. I do that sometimes. Sit with the engine off and listen to the tick of metal cooling. Richard used to say I was the only woman he knew who treated parking as a meditative practice. I told him I was running calculations. He said that was the same thing. I didn't know then how much would change in the next 72 hours. Or perhaps I did know, the way a structural engineer knows a beam has been compromised before the test confirms it. You develop a feel for load, for what will hold and what will not. The banana bread was on the passenger seat. I had baked it that morning, before the email came. Before I printed the letter and folded it into thirds and put it in my cardigan pocket. The banana bread was from a time before the letter, 6 a.m., flour on the counter, the kitchen smelling the way a kitchen should, on a day when you're going to see your son. The letter was from a different part of my life entirely. I was carrying both, and they didn't know about each other yet. David and Vanessa's house was a 4-bedroom colonial in Dublin. Nice neighborhood, good schools, which mattered because they were talking about children, or Vanessa was, in the way people talk about future projects, timelines, and milestones. I had offered to help with the down payment. Vanessa said that wouldn't be necessary. David said nothing, which I had learned was its own kind of answer. The front door was open. I picked up the banana bread and stepped out. The May air was warm and carried the smell of someone's grill 2 houses down. The lanterns threw uneven shadows on the walkway, wobbling circles of light that shifted every time the breeze moved. I walked through them like a woman crossing a bridge she'd inspected once and wasn't sure about anymore. Inside, the smell hit first. Roasted lamb, rosemary, something sweet underneath, lilac. Vanessa had put lilacs on every surface, purple and white, in mason jars with twine. It was beautiful. I want to be honest about that. Vanessa knew how to set a stage. I stepped through the doorway, and a woman I didn't recognize smiled at me. "Happy Mother's Day," she said, and handed me a glass of wine I hadn't asked for. I took it because that's what you do when someone hands you something. You take it, and you say thank you, and you look for the person who's supposed to make you feel like you belong here. I touched my cardigan pocket. The letter was still there. It had been there all day, folded in thirds, quiet as a promise. The table stretched from the dining room into the living room. 40 place settings, white tablecloth, good china. My china, actually, the set I had given them for the wedding. I recognized the pattern before I recognized my own name on a card near the far end. Not the center. Not near David. I noted this the way I used to note a beam placed slightly off-spec. Not alarming yet, just something to watch. When Richard and I hosted dinners, and we hosted many, in the years when the company was growing and every relationship was an investment, I built the seating chart, like I built everything else. With intention. You put the people who matter where they can see you, and you put yourself where you can see the room. That's not vanity. That's load distribution. If you're the one holding the evening together, you need line of sight. Vanessa had put me at the end where the table met the wall. To my left was a cousin I saw once a year. To my right was an empty chair that would later be filled by someone's boyfriend, a nice young man who spent most of dinner on his phone. Across from me, nothing. The table curved, and the chair across was angled toward the window. I was, architecturally speaking, at a dead end. I set the banana bread on the kitchen counter. No one asked about it. That was fine. I hadn't brought it to be noticed. I brought it because I always bring banana bread, and the day you stop bringing it is the day you admit something has changed. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment. Hit, like if you've ever been underestimated. David was across the room, near the fireplace, talking to two men I recognized from Vanessa's office. He wore the blue shirt I'd given him for Christmas, the one I'd ironed a crease into because he never could get the collar right. He saw me and waved, a loose wave, the kind you give someone you've spotted in an airport, not the kind you give your mother. He didn't come over. I sipped the wine. It was a good wine. Vanessa always chose well. I stood near the kitchen doorway and watched the room fill the way I used to watch a structure take load. Person by person, conversation by conversation. The weight distributed across the space. I was part of the structure, but I wasn't bearing any of it. I was just there, leaning against the frame, waiting for someone to give me something to hold. No one did. I touched the place card with my name. Margaret. Just Margaret. No Mum, no Mrs. Ellison. Just the 4 syllables, printed in Vanessa's careful handwriting, set at the far end of a table I had paid for, in a house I had offered to help buy, on a day that was supposed to be mine. I left the card where it was. I pulled out the chair and sat down. The appetizers came out on white platters. Bruschetta, something with goat cheese and figs, shrimp arranged in a spiral. Vanessa had hired a caterer, the kind of caterer who wears black and moves through a room like they're trying not to exist. I noticed them because I used to be like that, present but invisible, useful but unremarked upon. I took a piece of bruschetta and ate it slowly. The tomatoes were good, sweet, slightly acidic, the kind that come from a farm and not a warehouse. I was thinking about this, about tomatoes, when I heard Vanessa's voice carry from the hallway. The little house in Bexley, she was saying. Her tone was the tone of someone describing a fact they found charming, in the way you find a child's drawing charming, not for its quality, but for its effort. It's sweet, honestly. She's been there forever. I keep telling David we should help her update the kitchen, but you know how she is, set in her ways. The woman she was talking to laughed. A polite laugh, the kind that agrees without committing. I kept chewing the bruschetta. My house in Bexley has 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, and a load-bearing wall. I reinforced myself in 2003 when the original joists showed signs of settling. Richard and I raised David in that house. I drew the first meridian blueprints at the kitchen table she wanted to update. The house is not sweet. The house is sound. There's a difference. But I didn't say this. I didn't say anything. I took another piece of bruschetta and let Vanessa's words settle the way hairline cracks settle, slowly, almost invisibly, until one day the inspector comes and marks the whole section for review. A cousin, Richard's side, someone I saw at Thanksgiving, sat down next to me and said, "Margaret, hi, how are you? Still doing your puzzles?" "Puzzles," I said. "The building things. David mentioned you used to do something with buildings." "Structural engineering," I said. Right, like Lego." She laughed and patted my hand. I let her pat my hand. I let the word Lego sit between us like a small, inaccurate monument. Richard would have corrected her. Richard corrected everyone, gently but precisely. He was a history teacher, and accuracy was a reflex for him, the way it was a profession for me. But Richard had been dead for 5 years, and there was no one at this table whose job it was to say, "No, actually, she designed bridges. She co-founded a firm. She is not a puzzle." I finished my bruschetta. I wiped my fingers on the cloth napkin, also mine, from the wedding set, and looked at the room. 40 people, most of them Vanessa's colleagues and friends. A few family members, scattered like afterthoughts. The cousin moved on to talk to someone more interesting. I could hear Vanessa in the next room, still talking. Not about me anymore. About a project at work. Something about a new client. Her voice had that pitch, the one that rises slightly when she's performing competence for an audience. I recognized it because I'd heard it at every holiday dinner for 6 years. My father used to say, 1 crack is a crack, 2 cracks are a pattern, 3 cracks, and you stop asking why and start asking when. I was on crack number 3. I found David in the kitchen. He was refilling a water pitcher, his back to me, and for a moment, I just stood in the doorway and watched him. He had Richard's shoulders, broad, slightly rounded, as though they were always preparing to carry something. Richard carried grading. David carried whatever it was he wasn't telling me. "Hey, Mom." He turned and smiled, and the smile was genuine in the way a beam can be genuine, but insufficient, real material, wrong gauge. He was glad to see me. He was also wishing I weren't standing there. I could feel both things at once, the way you can feel a floor give slightly under your weight without actually breaking. "The lamb smells wonderful," I said. "Vanessa's been working on it all week. She wanted everything perfect." He said this with something between pride and apology. I noted the ratio. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." The universal lie. The foundation on which every family dinner is built. "Are you?" He paused. The water pitcher was full, and he was still holding it under the running faucet. Water spilled over the edge in a thin, steady stream. He looked at it like he'd forgotten what he was doing. Then he turned off the faucet and set the pitcher on the counter. "Work stuff," I said. "Nothing major." I knew that tone. It was the tone of something major wearing the costume of nothing, but I didn't push. I had learned over the years that pushing David was like pushing against a load-bearing wall. The harder you pressed, the more the whole structure resisted. You had to find the right entry point, the right question at the right angle. This was not the right time. He picked up the pitcher. "I should get this out there." "Of course." He passed me in the doorway, close enough that I could smell his aftershave, the same brand Richard used, and I wondered if David knew that, or if it was just a coincidence sold at CVS for $12. He touched my arm as he passed. A brief touch. The kind you give to say something you can't say out loud. Then he was gone. Back into the noise and the light, and the 40 people who were here to celebrate a holiday about mothers, in a house where the mother had been seated at the dead end of her own table. I stood in the kitchen alone. The faucet dripped once. I tightened the handle, reflex, not intention. You fix what you can reach. When David was 12, I let him help me grade a small bridge inspection report. Nothing serious. A county road bridge, 2 lanes, standard concrete deck. But I made him check every measurement twice. He complained. He said he'd already checked them. I told him, "The second check is not because you got it wrong. It's because the stakes are high enough to be certain." He'd understood back then. He was 12 and he understood. I don't know when he stopped understanding. Vanessa clinked her glass at 8:15. The sound cut through the room the way a single crack in concrete cuts through silence, small, precise, and impossible to ignore once you've heard it. Everyone turned. 40 faces angled toward her like sunflowers tracking light. She stood at the head of the table, the seat I would have chosen, the seat that gives you line of sight to every corner. And she was wearing a cream dress that caught the candlelight in a way I'm sure she had practiced. Vanessa didn't leave things to accident. I respected that about her. I want to be clear about that, even now. I want to say a few words, she said, about the women who shaped us. She smiled. The room warmed. These were the opening notes of something generous, something inclusive, something that would wrap itself around every woman in the room, like a quilt. I could feel people settling into the moment, the collective lean-in of an audience that knows it's about to hear something beautiful. My mother, Vanessa said, who worked 2 jobs and never once complained about it, who taught me that the only person responsible for your life is you. Applause. Light, respectful. Dr. Catherine Marsh, my advisor at Ohio State, who saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself and pushed me toward the MBA program that changed my life. More applause. Someone said, yes. I waited. The way you wait for a column of figures to add up. You know the total should be a certain number. You know the pattern. And you can feel, before the last figure appears, whether the sum will be right or wrong. And every woman in this room, Vanessa continued, who has chosen to define herself on her own terms, who refused to let anyone else tell her what she was worth. The room applauded again, louder this time. Someone raised a glass. She did not say my name. I sat at the dead end of the table with a glass of wine I'd barely touched, and a piece of lamb going cold on my plate. And I understood, not with the slow accumulation of evidence I'd been gathering all evening, but all at once, the way you understand a structural failure when the final report comes in. Not gradually, completely. This was not an oversight, this was architecture. Vanessa had designed this evening the way I had designed bridges, every element intentional, every load calculated, every absence as deliberate as every presence. She had named her mother. She had named her mentor. She had named the abstract concept of independence itself. And she had left a Margaret-shaped gap in the structure. And the gap was the point. I looked at David. He was looking at his plate. His fork was in his hand, but he wasn't eating. His shoulders, Richard's shoulders, were drawn forward, curved around something I couldn't see. Guilt, maybe, or the weight of whatever he wasn't saying. He didn't look up. He didn't look at me. The toast felt generous. It sounded generous. And that was the genius of it, because generosity that specifically excludes one person isn't generosity at all. It's a frame. And I had just been cut out of it. I took a breath, set my fork down, touched my cardigan pocket. The letter was still there. The toast was not over. Vanessa set her glass down and clasped her hands in front of her. The shift was subtle, from celebration to testimony. I recognized it because I'd seen it in boardrooms, when someone stops toasting and starts building a case. I want to be honest about something, she said, because this day, Mother's Day, is about honesty too. The room quieted further. Not the polite quiet of a toast, but the held breath quiet of people who sense they're about to witness something they'll talk about later. I felt 40 pairs of eyes redistribute. Some stayed on Vanessa, some found me. There was a time, Vanessa said, when someone in our family tried to help us. And I know it came from a good place. I do. She paused. She was good at pauses, the kind that create space for the audience to fill with their own assumptions. But there's a kind of help that doesn't feel like help. There's a kind of generosity that comes with strings, that comes with the expectation that you'll always be grateful, that you'll always need it, that you can't do it on your own. She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. Every person at that table knew the architecture of this family, and every person understood who the unnamed benefactor was. I was being described in the third person while sitting 12 feet away, and the distance between us might as well have been the length of a bridge I had inspected and condemned. When David and I got married, Vanessa continued, there were gifts, beautiful gifts, generous gifts. She gestured, lightly, almost unconsciously, toward the china we were eating from. My china. But every gift came with a visit. Every visit came with advice. Every piece of advice came with the implication that we weren't doing enough, that we didn't know how to build our own life. This was a rewrite, a clean, confident rewrite of 6 years of history, delivered to an audience that had no access to the source material. The wedding gift was not conditional. The visits were not uninvited. They were accepted and sometimes requested. The advice was given when asked for, and only when asked for. But facts are architecture, and Vanessa was a demolition expert who knew exactly which walls to remove to make the old structure look like it had never stood at all. I made a decision, Vanessa said. Her voice was steady, not angry, not sad, resolved. I decided that I was going to build my own foundation, my career, my home, my family, on my terms. And that meant setting boundaries with people who couldn't respect the difference between supporting someone and controlling them. She looked at me. For the first time in the speech, she looked directly at me. Margaret, she said, I love you, I do. But until we can establish a relationship that respects the life David and I have built together on our own, I think it's best if we take some space. This house, this family, this life, it's ours. And I need you to see that. 40 people, 40 faces, some looking at me, some looking away. One, an older woman near the center of the table, someone's aunt, was looking at her plate the way David was looking at his. The room was so quiet I could hear the candles hiss. My hand was on the letter. I hadn't decided to put it there. It had moved on its own, the way your hand moves to steady yourself when the ground shifts. The paper was warm from being against my body all day. $2.3 million, folded in thirds, pressed against my ribs. I could have unfolded it. I could have stood up and read it aloud and watched Vanessa's architecture collapse in real time, the MBA I funded, the career built on a company I co-founded, the house in Dublin that existed because the industry I built existed. I could have turned the room inside out with a single piece of paper. I didn't. Not because I am kind. Not because I am weak. Because I am an engineer, and engineers do not respond to structural failures with explosions. They assess. They document. They calculate what can be saved and what must be condemned. And they do it with the lights on and the instruments calibrated, and enough distance to see the whole structure, not just the crack. Vanessa was still looking at me, waiting for a reaction. The room was waiting. I gave them nothing. I folded my napkin. I placed it beside my plate, the china I had given, on the tablecloth I had given, at the table I had given. I did not stand up. Not yet. I sat for a moment longer, and I looked at my son. David's eyes were on his plate. His fork hadn't moved. Richard's shoulders were curled so far forward that I thought, briefly, of a bridge bearing more weight than its design specification. Something in him was close to failing, but he did not look up. He did not say, "That's enough." He did not say anything at all. I noted this, the way I note everything. Not with anger, with the specificity. I stood up. The chair made a sound against the floor, not loud, just present, the kind of sound that announces a decision. I did not speak. There was nothing to say to this room that would change what had just happened. And I was not in the business of performing for an audience that had already decided I was the supporting character in someone else's narrative. I picked up my purse from the back of the chair. The leather was soft, a bag I'd owned for 14 years, brown, scuffed at the corners. Richard bought it at a shop in German Village before they turned it into a boutique. The strap was fraying, but the stitching held. Good construction is like that. The surface wears, but the joints keep. I walked. The table was long, 40-place settings, stretching from the dining room into the living room, and my seat was at the far end, which meant the walk to the front door was the longest walk of the evening. I passed faces on both sides. Some I knew. Most I didn't. The cousin who thought I did puzzles. The boyfriend who'd been on his phone. A woman I'd met at David's birthday 2 years ago who had asked me about my cardigan and meant it as a compliment. Some of them looked at me. Some of them looked away. I catalogued each response the way I would catalogue each joint in a bridge, who held and who didn't. Not to punish, just to know. Because knowing is the first part of any calculation, and I was beginning to calculate. An older woman, silver hair, seated near the middle, someone's aunt or mother, reached out as I passed and touched my arm. Just her fingertips, on the sleeve of my Costco cardigan. She didn't say anything. Her eyes said it. I nodded. One nod. The kind that means, I see you too. Then I was at the door. The front door was still open the way it had been when I arrived, propped, welcoming, designed to make people feel the house was generous. The lanterns were still flickering on the walkway, uneven, unreliable. I had thought so when I arrived, and I thought so now, and the consistency of my assessment gave me a thin kind of comfort. I stepped outside. The May air was cooler now, past 8, the sun gone, the kind of twilight that turns everything blue-grey. The grill, 2 houses down, had stopped. The neighborhood was quiet, in the way suburbs are quiet at night, not silence, but the organized absence of noise. Sprinklers and distant televisions, and the hum of things plugged in. Behind me, the house held 40 people, and the sound of someone beginning to talk again, not Vanessa, someone else, filling the space my exit had created. That's what happens when a load is removed from a structure. The remaining elements redistribute. They adjust. They don't collapse. They just carry the weight differently. I walked to the Subaru. The lanterns followed me with their uneven light. The letter was still in my pocket. I had not used it. I had chosen not to. And the choice sat in my chest like a second heartbeat, steady, present, waiting to be understood. I sat in the Subaru and did not start it. The dome light was off. The street was dark, except for the lanterns behind me and a porch light across the road. I put my hands on the steering wheel and held them there, 10 and 2, the way my father taught me, and I let myself feel it. 90 seconds. That's what I gave myself. I had learned this from 30 years of field inspections. When a structure fails, and you're standing inside it, you get 90 seconds to feel the fear, and then you get to work. The fear is real. The work is how you survive it. So, I sat in the dark in my Subaru with the dented rear bumper, and I let the speech play back. Every word, every pause. The way Vanessa had said my name, Margaret, like she was naming a problem. The china, the advice, the boundaries. The house that was theirs, built together, on their own. And David with his head down, his fork still, Richard's shoulders curved around whatever secret he was carrying, saying nothing while his wife disassembled his mother in front of 40 people. 90 seconds. Then I reached into my left cardigan pocket and pulled out the letter. I turned on the dome light. The paper was warm, slightly damp from being against my body all day. I unfolded it. 3 creases, sharp, the kind I make by habit. Neat folds, aligned edges. Precision, even in paper. The letterhead read, Meridian Structural Consulting, Board of Directors. The body read, Equity Buyback Notice, Co-founder Shares, 2.3 million, standard terms. A formality? The kind of letter that comes when a company has grown large enough that the original architecture needs to be acknowledged and reorganized. Robert's family had initiated it. His shares had been in trust since 2018. Mine had been sitting silently for 30 years, accruing value the way a well-placed foundation accrues weight, invisibly, inevitably, without complaint. I read it twice, the way I read everything, the second check. I co-founded Meridian in 1994 with Robert Chen in his garage. I stepped back when David was born. I retained my equity. I never told David, because the company was never about David. It was about bridges and buildings and the invisible math that keeps things standing. Richard knew, Robert knew, Arthur knew, that was enough. Except now, the company employed 200 people. And one of those people was David, hired through normal channels 4 years ago, managing supply chains in a firm his mother built. And the firm's largest external contract, $4.2 million annually, was with Hayden Group, where the VP of Business Development was Vanessa Park Ellison. My daughter-in-law had just publicly humiliated the woman who built the foundation she stood on. The irony did not make me laugh. It made me tired. A deep, structural tiredness, the kind that lives in the bones of old buildings, in the steel of bridges that have carried more than they were designed for longer than anyone planned. I folded the letter back into thirds. I put it in my pocket. I started the car. Eleanor's kitchen was dark, except for the light above the stove. She left it on the way. Some people leave porch lights on, not for seeing, but for the principle of it. Something should always be lit. I understood that. It was past midnight. Eleanor had gone to bed 20 minutes after I arrived. She hadn't asked me to stay. She'd said, "The guest room is made up," which was the same thing, but required nothing of either of us. The bourbon was still on the counter. I hadn't touched it. I stood at the sink. The window above it faced her backyard, the fence, the birch tree, the neighbor's house where the upstairs light was still on. Someone else awake. I didn't wonder why. Everyone has their midnight. I reached into my left cardigan pocket and took out the letter. I hadn't looked at it since the car. In the car, it had been evidence. Here, in Eleanor's kitchen, with the stove light making the paper almost amber, it was something else. It was the distance between who Vanessa thought I was and who I actually am, measured in dollars and decades, and the quiet mathematics of a life spent building things that hold. 2.3 million. I set the letter on the counter. The paper caught the light. The creases were still sharp, 3 folds, aligned. The way I fold everything, precision even now, especially now. My hands were shaking, not much. A tremor in the left one, the one that had held the steering wheel at 10 and 2 all the way from Dublin. I pressed both palms, flat, against the countertop, cool laminate, solid. I held them there until the tremor stopped. The neighbor's light went off. I stood in Eleanor's kitchen in the dark arithmetic of what had happened, and I did not yet know what I would do about it. The letter lay on the counter between the bourbon and the dish rack, and the stove light held, and the house was quiet. And I was not ready. Not yet. I left the letter on the counter. I turned off the stove light. I went to the guest room and lay down on top of the covers, still in my cardigan, and I listened to the house settle around me, the small clicks and sighs of a structure doing what structures do in the dark. Holding. I drove to Eleanor's. It was 20 minutes from Dublin to Bexley, and I drove them in silence. No radio, no phone, just the sound of the engine and the road, and the thoughts. I wasn't ready to think yet. Eleanor's house was 3 doors down from mine. We had been neighbours for 22 years, which in Bexley is the equivalent of having served together in a war. You don't explain things to someone who has watched you bring in groceries in the rain for 2 decades. You just show up. She was on the porch, 9:40 at night, and she was sitting in the green wicker chair with a book and a glass of bourbon and the porch light on. The same porch light she'd had for 22 years. A simple fixture, brass, slightly tarnished. She'd never replaced it because it still worked. I understood this deeply. You don't retire a thing that still does its job. She looked up when I pulled into the driveway. She didn't look surprised. Eleanor never looked surprised. 30 years as a school principal had trained the surprise out of her. She just watched me get out of the car and walk up her steps and sit in the empty chair beside her. The one she kept there for no reason she'd ever stated, but which was always empty, always available. As if she'd built her porch with the assumption that someone would need it. Sit, she said, even though I was already sitting. I sat. The wicker creaked. The bourbon on the side table caught the porch light and glowed amber. The night was warm, and the neighborhood was quiet, and the crickets were doing whatever it is crickets do when they think no one is listening. Eleanor didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why I was there at 9:40 on Mother's Day instead of at my son's house eating lamb and being celebrated. She just sat beside me and read her book, or pretended to, and waited. That was Eleanor. She didn't comfort, she didn't advise. She witnessed. She had the patience of a woman who had spent 3 decades watching children become people and had learned that most of the important things happen in silence. I sat for a long time. 5 minutes, maybe 10. The bourbon glowed. The porch light held. A car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping across the yard, and then gone. The dinner was bad, I said. I gathered. She didn't look up from her book. Vanessa made a speech. Eleanor turned a page. Whether she was reading or not was between her and the book. About you? About who she thinks I am? Eleanor set the book down on her lap, open, spine up. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses, the same glasses she'd worn to every PTA meeting and school board hearing for 15 years. And who does she think you are? Someone who needs to be managed, contained, thanked politely and shown the door. Eleanor took off her glasses. She did that when she was done pretending to be patient. She said this in front of people, 40 of them. In your son's house, with your china. Their house, I said. My china. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The bourbon caught the porch light. And David? David looked at his plate. She put her glasses back on, picked up her book, set it down again. I'd like to say I'm surprised, she said, but I've spent 30 years watching people choose comfort over courage, and it never does surprise me. It just disappoints me in a very specific way. I didn't answer right away. The crickets filled the silence, and the porch light held, steady and brass and 22 years old. And I thought, this light has outlasted my marriage, my career, my son's ability to look me in the eye. She thinks I'm small, I said. Eleanor picked up her bourbon, took a sip, set it down. Well, she said, people do make that mistake. The porch light buzzed once, then held. We went inside. Eleanor's kitchen was the kind of kitchen that hadn't been renovated since 1998 and didn't need to be: linoleum floor, oak cabinets, a refrigerator that hummed a low G sharp. I knew the note because Richard had once tuned his guitar to it as a joke. The kitchen smelled like coffee and dish soap and the particular warmth of a house that has been lived in by the same person for a long time. Eleanor sat at the table. I sat across from her. She poured me a bourbon without asking, 2 fingers, neat, in a glass with a chip on the rim that she'd never thrown away. I held it, but didn't drink. The glass was cool against my palm. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. Sparse, factual. The place card at the end. The cousin who thought I did puzzles. The toast that named everyone except me. The speech. The word boundaries, used like a scalpel. David's silence. The walk past 40 faces. The lanterns. Eleanor listened the way she always listened. Without interruption. Without expression. Without the small noises people make to signal sympathy. She listened like she was taking notes for a report she would never have to write. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet, except for the refrigerator's G-sharp. Eleanor looked at her bourbon, then at me. "You have the letter," she said. Not a question. I pulled it from my pocket. The paper was soft now. Hours of body heat and handling had turned it from a crisp printout into something that felt more like fabric. I unfolded it and set it on the table between us. Eleanor read it. She read slowly, the way she read everything, a principles reading, where every word is assessed for accuracy and every sentence is checked for what's missing. When she finished, she set it down and placed her hand on the table, not on the letter but near it, the way you place your hand near a wound without touching it. "So what are you going to do with that?" she said. I looked at the letter, the meridian letterhead, the numbers, the words that described, in legal language, the shape of something I had built and then walked away from, and that had grown quietly into the foundation beneath everything I had lost tonight. "I don't know," I said. Eleanor poured me more bourbon. She didn't say anything for a while. The refrigerator hummed. A faucet dripped once. Her kitchen faucet had been dripping for 3 years, and every time I offered to fix it, she said she liked the company. "That letter," she said, "is either a shield or a sword, and I'm not going to tell you which one to pick." I wasn't asking you to. I know. She took a sip. "But I'm telling you anyway that you get to choose. That's the part they took from you tonight, the choosing." I held the bourbon, the chip in the glass pressed against my ring finger, the finger that used to wear a wedding band. I'd moved the band to a chain around my neck after Richard died. It hung there now, under the cardigan, near the letter, near my heart, near all the things I carried that no one could see. If you're still with me, subscribe. This story is just getting started. The buyback notice had a response deadline, 30 days from the date of the email. I had received it that morning. I had 29 days left. 29 days to decide whether to stay invisible or to let the structure I built finally bear my name. Eleanor's faucet dripped. The refrigerator hummed. The letter sat on the table between us like a bridge between two versions of myself, the one who walked into that dinner and the one who would walk out of this kitchen. I picked it up, folded it back into the thirds, put it in my pocket. "I need to make a phone call," I said. Eleanor nodded. "I'll be here." I stepped onto her porch and pulled out my phone. The porch light was steady. The night was warm. I scrolled to Arthur Hendricks and pressed call. He answered on the second ring. I woke up at 5:30. The house was Sunday quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't just mean absence of sound, but presence of stillness. I lay in bed for a few minutes and listened to it. The creak of the house settling, the furnace cycling on, then off. A bird outside, persistent and alone. Richard used to be up before me. He'd have the coffee going and the newspaper unfolded on the table, and he'd be sitting there in his robe reading the obituaries first because he said they were the only honest part of the paper. "No one lies about the dead," he told me once. "They exaggerate, but they don't lie." I told him that was the same thing. He said it wasn't. The coffee pot was automatic. I set it the night before, every night, the way I set the thermostat and the porch light and the alarm I no longer needed because I always woke before it. Routine is a kind of architecture. You build it once, and if you build it well, it holds without maintenance. I made toast, wheat bread, butter, a thin layer of the strawberry jam I'd canned last September. I ate it standing at the kitchen counter because the table was too large for one person, and I had stopped pretending otherwise. The toast was good, the jam was good, the coffee was the same coffee it always was, and the steadiness of it was what I needed. I did not check my phone. I knew there would be nothing from David. Not yet. Maybe not for days. And I knew that checking would turn absence into evidence. I had enough evidence. What I needed now was space to think. The house fit me. It had always fit me, even when Richard was alive, and it fit both of us, even when David was small, and it fit three. It was a ranch house on a quiet street in Bexley, and I had lived here for 30 years, and every modification, the reinforced wall in 2003, the updated electrical in 2011, the garden bed I'd expanded twice, was mine. Not the little house in Bexley Vanessa had described, not a project that needed updating. A home that had been tended by someone who understood what tending meant. I sat on the back porch with my coffee. The garden was coming in. The tomatoes I'd planted in April were starting to climb the wire cages, and the zinnias along the fence were budding but not yet open. I liked this stage of a garden. All potential, no resolution. Everything reaching towards something it hadn't become yet. I thought about calling David. The thought arrived like a draft through a door I'd forgotten to close, sudden, physical, unwanted. I let it pass through. I did not pick up the phone. I did not close the door. I just let the draft move through the house and settle, the way drafts do, into the corners where they can't do any damage. The tomatoes climbed. The coffee cooled. The morning was ordinary in every way that mattered. And the ordinariness was not a comfort, but a fact. I was still here. The house was still sound. The letter was on my nightstand, folded in thirds. And the phone call to Arthur was 12 hours old, and the decision was somewhere ahead of me, like a bridge I hadn't built yet, but could already see the foundations for. I washed my cup. I got dressed. I put the letter in my pocket. Alice's diner was on Main Street in Bexley, wedged between a dry cleaner and a bookstore that had been closing for 4 years. I'd been going every Sunday for the past 7 years, since Richard died, and the Sunday morning ritual needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Richard and I used to cook breakfast together. After him, I couldn't stand the kitchen on Sunday mornings. Too much counter space. Too many empty chairs. Alice's solved this, a booth by the window. A waitress named Carol, who knew my order, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, no substitutions. The same order every week, and Carol brought it without asking, which is a small kindness that people who've never eaten alone don't understand. I sat in my booth and let the diner noise wash over me, forks on plates, the sizzle from the grill, a child 3 tables over, arguing about pancakes. Normal sounds. Sunday sounds. The architecture of routine holding me upright while I did the work I'd come to do. I opened my phone. Arthur had sent the full Meridian equity package at 11:47 the previous night. 1 email. No subject line. 3 attachments. The buyback notice, the founding agreement, 1994, 2 signatures, mine and Robert's, and a current cap table showing the distribution of shares. Arthur's communication style was a form of engineering in itself, no excess material, every element load-bearing. I read the buyback notice first, 2.3 million, payable in installments over 18 months, in exchange for my founder shares. Standard terms, clean language. But there was a clause, section 4B, that I had missed in the printed letter. The buyback could be accepted in full, cash payout, complete divestiture, or in part, with the option to retain a board position commensurate with remaining equity, a board position, specifically board chair. The founding agreement included a succession clause that Robert and I had written at 3 a.m. in his garage, when we were too tired to be practical and just honest enough to be thorough. If either co-founder returned to an active governance role, they would assume the chair position. We'd written it as insurance, a fail-safe, in case the company needed its architects again. Neither of us expected to use it. Robert died in 2018. I had never exercised it. Until now, it had been a dormant clause in a document no one read. Carol refilled my coffee. I tilted the phone slightly away from her, not because the numbers were secret, but because they were mine, and I wasn't ready to share the weight of them with anyone except the people who already knew. The cap table was simple. Robert's family trust held 40%. I held 31%. The rest was distributed among early investors and an employee stock option pool. My 31% made me the largest individual shareholder. I set the phone down and looked out the window. Main Street was quiet. The bookstore was still closing. The dry cleaner was open, and a woman was walking in with an armful of shirts. I picked up my coffee and thought about load calculations, about the difference between weight a structure can bear and weight it was designed to bear, about what happens when you add a new load to a system that has been operating at capacity without knowing it. My eggs were getting cold. I ate them anyway. Cold eggs are still eggs. You work with what's in front of you. I called Arthur from the parking lot. The Subaru was warm from the sun, the steering wheel almost too hot to touch, and the seatbelt buckle was the kind of warm that leaves a mark. I rolled down both windows and let the air circulate before I dialed. He picked up on the second ring. Arthur always picked up on the second ring. Not the first, that would suggest he'd been waiting, not the third, that would suggest delay. The second ring was Arthur's way of saying, I was doing something, but you are more important than what I was doing. It was a form of courtesy so precise it bordered on engineering. Margaret, I read the full package. I know. You read everything. Section 4B. A pause. Arthur's pauses were not empty. They were structural. Weight-bearing silences designed to let the other person arrive at the next thought on their own. The board position, he said. Yes. It's been in the founding agreement since 1994. Robert and I wrote it at 3 a.m. I remember the coffee was bad. The coffee was always bad in that garage. Margaret. Another pause. This one different, deliberate. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right. Are you sure this is about the company and not about last night? I watched a woman cross the parking lot with a bag of groceries. She was moving efficiently, keys already in hand, bag balanced on one hip. She had somewhere to be, and she was getting there without drama. I envied that kind of simplicity. It's about both, I said, and that's allowed. Arthur was quiet. I could hear something in the background, a television maybe, or a radio. Sunday sounds. Even Arthur Hendricks had Sunday sounds. Yes, he said, it is allowed. I just needed to hear you say it. You needed to know my motive. I needed to know you knew your motive. There's a difference. He was right. There was a difference. The same way there's a difference between a bridge that fails because of a design flaw and a bridge that fails because someone changed the load parameters after construction. Both fail. But the cause determines the response. I was not acting out of spite. I was not acting out of grief. I was acting because a letter had arrived on the same day I was publicly erased. And the coincidence was not a coincidence, It was a convergence. Two parts of my life that I had kept separate for 30 years had collided, and the collision had revealed a truth I could no longer pretend didn't matter. I had built something, and the people standing on it didn't know I existed. I want to accept the partial buyback, I said. Retain the board position. Chair. I'll draft the papers. Arthur. Yes. David works at Meridian. The silence that followed was the longest of the call. Not empty. Full. Arthur was calculating, not numbers, but consequences. The same way I was. I'm aware, he said. I need his employment status documented before any announcement. I need it on record that he was hired through normal channels and that his position is merit-based. No one questions his standing. Done. Thank you. Margaret. Yes. Get some sleep. He hung up. One sentence. That was Arthur. I sat in the parking lot and let the warm air move through the car and thought about what I had just set in motion. A car pulled into the spot next to mine. A family, mother, father, two children, arguing about where to eat. The mother said, Alice's. The father said anywhere but Alice's. The children said pancakes. Normal, Sunday, ordinary. I started the car and drove home. The drafting table was Richard's gift for my 40th birthday. He'd found it at an estate sale, solid oak, adjustable tilt, the kind of table that had been built for someone who worked with their hands and their mind simultaneously. It sat in the spare room we'd converted into my study, next to a window that looked out on the backyard. And it was the one piece of furniture in the house I would never give away. Not because of sentiment, because of function. The table worked. I pulled the fireproof cabinet from under the desk. Grey steel, combination lock, heavy enough that moving it required planning. Inside, the founding documents of Meridian Structural Consulting. 2 manila folders, a stack of early contracts, and a photograph I'd forgotten was there until I opened the cabinet, and it slid out like a memory escaping. The photograph was from 1994. Robert Chen and I, standing in his garage, with the folding table behind us where we'd signed the incorporation papers. Robert was grinning. He always grinned. It was his default, the expression he wore like other people wear glasses. I was holding a rolled-up blueprint. I don't remember what the blueprint was for. Something small. A storage facility maybe, or a retaining wall. Our first contracts were small because we were small, and we didn't pretend otherwise. I set the photograph on the drafting table and opened the folders. The founding agreement was 12 pages. Robert and I had written it ourselves. No lawyer, no template, just two structural engineers who understood that the document needed to bear the same loads as the structures they were designing. Every clause was intentional. Every contingency was accounted for. We were meticulous because that was the job, to anticipate failure before it happened and build against it. I turned to the succession clause. Page 8, section 4. Robert's handwriting in the margin. Add, co-founder, return provision, M's idea, my idea. I had insisted on it because I was stepping back. David was 2 years old, and I wanted to be there for the parts of his childhood that didn't wait for convenient timing. Robert understood. He had a daughter the same age. We were both trying to build two things at once, a company and a family, and we both knew that one of them would have to be patient. I chose the company. The company waited. David didn't, or I thought he didn't. Looking back, I wonder if David waited too, waited for me to come back from whatever quiet place I'd retreated to after the company grew beyond my daily involvement. Waited for me to be the mother who checked measurements instead of the mother who sent checks. I don't know. You can't inspect a relationship the way you inspect a bridge. The measurement tools are different and the failure modes are invisible until they're catastrophic. The early contracts were in the second folder. 1994 through 1998, the growth years. County projects, municipal buildings, a pedestrian bridge in Clintonville that I still drive past sometimes. Each contract had my signature at the bottom, next to Robert's. Margaret Ellison, PE, professional engineer. The letters after my name that Vanessa's cousin had replaced with puzzles. I spread the documents across the drafting table and looked at them the way you look at the foundation of a building you're about to re-enter. Not with nostalgia, with assessment. What still holds? What has settled? What needs reinforcement? The company had grown, 200 employees now, contracts across Ohio and into 3 neighboring states. A reputation in the structural engineering community that Robert and I had built, beam by beam, report by report, one inspection at a time. Robert died in 2018, pancreatic cancer, fast, the kind that doesn't negotiate, and his family had kept his shares in trust. My shares had sat in this fireproof cabinet, along with the photographs and the founding documents and the handwritten notes in the margins, accruing value the way a well-designed foundation accrues reliability, quietly, certainly, without anyone noticing. I picked up the photograph again. Robert's grin, my blueprint, the garage. "We did a good job, Robert," I said to no one. The room didn't answer. The drafting table held. I put the documents back in the cabinet, locked it, and sat at the table. I ran my hand across the surface, oak grain, smooth from years of contact, the kind of surface that records every touch without showing it. The founding documents were evidence of what I had built, but they were also evidence of what I had chosen to leave, and that leaving, which I had always understood as love, as sacrifice, as making room, had made me invisible. Not to the world, to my own family. Vanessa thought the little house in Bexley was all there was. She thought the banana bread and the Costco cardigans and the 2009 Subaru were the fire. I drew the map on a piece of graph paper, not because I needed to see it. I could hold the connections in my head the way I held load calculations, stacked and cross-referenced, but there's a difference between knowing something and seeing it. Seeing makes it real. Seeing makes it something you can't unfeel. At the top of the page, Meridian Structural Consulting, 200 employees, annual revenue I'd learned from the quarterly reports Arthur sent. Numbers I won't share because they're not the point. The point is the shape. From Meridian, a line down and to the right. Hayden Group, Meridian's largest external client. A commercial development firm that relied on Meridian for structural subcontracting on every major project. The contract between them was worth $4.2 million per year. I knew this because I'd read the annual report. I read it the way I read everything, twice. From Hayden Group, a line to the left, Vanessa Park Ellison, VP of Business Development. The person at Hayden responsible for managing key partnerships, including, presumably, the relationship with Meridian, the firm I co-founded. From Meridian, a second line down, David Ellison, supply chain manager. Hired 4 years ago through normal channels. Employee number 187. He didn't know. He managed invoices and vendor relationships for a company his mother had built, and he had no idea. Not because I had hidden it, I'd simply never told him, because the company was never about him. It was about bridges and buildings and the work, and from the top, from Meridian, a line, back to me. Margaret Ellison, co-founder, largest individual shareholder, incoming board chair. I stared at the graph paper. The lines formed a structure, closed, self-referencing, like a trust system where every member carries load and every joint is shared. Remove one element, and the whole shape changes. Remove the element at the top, remove me, and the system holds. It has held for 30 years without acknowledging me, but make the element at the top visible, and suddenly, every connection is redefined. Vanessa's career existed within a structure that began with me. Her independence, the independence she'd celebrated in front of 40 people, was built on contracts that flowed through a company I'd founded. Her MBA had been funded by me. Her husband worked for me. The industry she climbed through was an industry I'd helped create. She didn't know any of this. That was the vertigo. Not the vertigo of height, the vertigo of depth. The realization that the ground you're standing on is not ground at all, but the roof of something older and deeper. And the person who built it has been standing beneath you the whole time, holding the weight, saying nothing. I didn't feel triumph at this realization. I've heard people describe revenge as satisfying, as sweet, as something that fills the space where pain used to be. What I felt was closer to what I felt the first time I understood that a building I'd inspected was standing on compromised foundations. Not excitement, not satisfaction, a kind of professional grief. Everything looks fine from the outside. The math doesn't hold underneath. I folded the graph paper and put it in the cabinet with the founding documents. It didn't belong there. It was a napkin sketch, not a legal document, but it felt right. The history of the company and the map of its consequences filed together. I closed the cabinet, spun the combination lock. Somewhere in Dublin, Ohio, Vanessa Park Ellison was going to bed in a house she believed she had built on her own terms. Somewhere at Meridian, David Ellison's department was carrying a billing error he thought his mother might know about. And somewhere between these two facts, in the space between what people believe and what is true, I was standing, the way I had always been standing, under the foundation, holding the load. The difference was that now I was going to step out from under it, and when I did, they would feel the shift. Eleanor's kitchen on a Tuesday evening. Not our usual time, we did Wednesday coffee, a routine so fixed it had its own gravitational pull, but I had called and said, "Can I come over?" And Eleanor had said, "Bring nothing," which was her way of saying yes. She made tea. Not bourbon, tea, because Eleanor could read a situation the way I read load calculations, and she knew that bourbon was for absorbing pain, and tea was for making decisions. She set 2 mugs on the table, the blue one for me, the green one for her, the same mugs she'd had since she retired from the school district 8 years ago, and sat down. "Tell me," she said. I laid it out. Not the emotions. She already knew those. She had seen my face on the porch, and she had heard about the dinner, and she didn't need a second telling. What I laid out was the structure. Meridian, Hayden Group, Vanessa's position, David's employment, the buyback, the board chair clause, the graph paper with its lines and intersections, which I had brought with me and spread on her kitchen table like a blueprint. Eleanor looked at it. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, carefully, without hurry, with the patience of a woman who had disciplined 2,000 teenagers and learned that most situations improve if you wait long enough to see them clearly. "You could ruin her," Eleanor said. "I know." Not directly. But the consequence of you becoming visible is that her position becomes complicated, conflicted. There's a conflict of interest. Hayden's VP managing the relationship with a company whose board chair is her mother-in-law. Right. Eleanor sipped her tea. And David. David learns where he works, who built it, what he didn't know. What you didn't tell him. I took the correction. She was right. I hadn't told him. That was a choice I had made, for reasons I still believed were valid. But the impact of not telling was the same as the impact of telling would have been. Someone I loved was operating without complete information. The failure was architectural, and I was part of the architecture. Is that what you want? Eleanor said. To ruin her? No. I said it immediately, and the immediacy surprised me. I had expected to hesitate. I had expected the question to be hard. It wasn't. I want to be known. Eleanor set her mug down. The green one, the one with the small chip at the handle she'd never fixed. Known, she repeated. They think I'm the banana bread, and the cardigan, and the little house in Bexley. They think I'm a nice woman who means well, and doesn't quite understand how the world works. They think I need their help, their boundaries, their permission. I stopped. I took a breath. I wasn't used to speaking this many sentences in a row, not about myself. I measured my words the way I measured everything else, carefully, one at a time. I don't need their permission, I said, and I don't need their destruction. I just need the truth to be visible. What happens after the truth is visible, that's not my design. That's consequence. That's worse, isn't it? Eleanor said. I looked at her. What do you mean? Revenge? People understand. You hurt me, I hurt you. It's a closed circuit. But what you're describing isn't revenge. It's revelation. And revelation doesn't stop where you want it to. It goes where the truth goes. I held my mug. The tea was cooling. The kitchen was quiet. The faucet dripped its familiar drip, and the refrigerator hummed its familiar G-sharp. And the evening light through the window was the same light that had been coming through that window for 22 years. Depends on who you're asking, Eleanor said. She picked up her mug and drank. I picked up mine. We sat in the quiet of her kitchen, two women past 60, drinking tea at a table that had seen 1,000 evenings just like this one. And I thought about what she'd said. Revelation goes where the truth goes. You can build it, but you can't control where it lands. That was the engineering of it. You design the structure. You don't design the earthquake. I drove home that night and didn't listen to the radio. Eleanor's words turned in my head like a bolt that needed one more quarter turn to hold. Arthur's office was on the 4th floor of a building on East Broad Street. I had been there many times over the years, for wills, for trusts, for the quiet legal maintenance of a life that looked simple from the outside and was, underneath, precisely organized. Arthur had been Richard's college roommate before he was my attorney. He knew me the way the foundation knows the building, from underneath, bearing the weight of things no one else sees. The office hadn't changed. The same oak desk. He and Richard had the same taste in wood, which is either a coincidence or a theory about Midwestern men that I've never tested. The same bookshelves, law volumes that had been replaced by databases, but kept for what Arthur called ballast. A coffee mug on the desk that said, "World's okayest lawyer," a gift from his daughter. Arthur was not the world's okayest lawyer. He was the kind of lawyer who answered texts at 11 p.m. with one-sentence replies and had never once told me what to do. I sat across from him. He set the papers on the desk between us. 3 documents: the partial buyback acceptance, the board chair appointment letter, and a 1-page memo detailing the timeline for announcement. Walk me through it, I said, even though I'd already read them. The second check, Arthur walked me through it. The partial buyback. I would release a portion of my shares for $2.3 million, paid in installments over 18 months. I would retain a 16% equity position, enough to make me the second largest individual holder behind Robert's Family Trust. The board chair appointment, effective immediately upon acceptance, to be publicly announced at the next scheduled board meeting, June the 3rd, 3 weeks away. The announcement memo, coordinated with the current CEO, a man named Bradley Wells, whom I had never met, but whom Arthur described as competent and not threatened. Bradley is a good operator, Arthur said. He built the company Robert and you designed. We designed the company. He scaled it. Fair. I looked at the papers. The pen was on the desk, Arthur's pen, a Mont Blanc that Robert had given him 20 years ago. It was heavy in a way that felt intentional, as though the weight was designed to make you pause before signing. I picked it up. I thought of 1994, the folding table in Robert's garage. 2 signatures, mine and his, on papers that smelled like coffee and ambition. I was 30 years old. David was a baby sleeping in a car seat in the corner. Richard was outside washing the car, because Richard always found something useful to do when I was making decisions. I was 62 now. Robert was dead. Richard was dead. David was 38 and didn't know where he worked. And I was signing papers that would in 3 weeks make all of this visible. The pen touched paper. My signature is the same one it's always been. Margaret Ellison, compact, unhesitating. The same signature on 1,000 bridge inspections, and a founding agreement, and a death certificate. And now this. The pen didn't waver. My hand didn't shake. I signed each document once, and the ink was dark, and the lines were clean. Arthur collected the papers. He tapped them into alignment on the desk, a neat stack, edges flush. I'll file these today. Thank you, Arthur. Margaret, yes? He looked at me over the Mont Blanc. You're going to be fine. It was the closest Arthur Hendricks had ever come to telling me what to do. I took it as the compliment it was. I left the office and walked to my car. The city was bright with late May sun. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until the structure I built finally bore my name. 3 weeks is a long time when you're waiting for something to become real. I know this from construction. You pour a foundation and then you wait for it to cure. 28 days for concrete to reach full strength, though most of the work happens in the first 7. You can't rush it. You can't stand over it and will it to harden. You can only control the conditions, temperature, moisture, protection from load. And then you wait. I waited. I tended the garden. The tomatoes needed staking. They had grown past the wire cages, which happens every year and which I allow because the excess growth means the roots are healthy. I drove stakes and tied the vines with soft twine, the same kind Vanessa had used on the lilac jars. I noticed this. I didn't dwell on it. I went to Alice's diner every Sunday. Carol brought my eggs and my coffee and asked how I was doing, and I said, "Fine, thank you, Carol." And she said, "Good, good." And we had the conversation we always had, which was not a conversation at all, but a ritual. And rituals hold you the way structures hold weight. Not by being exciting, but by being there. Arthur sent me things. Meridian's quarterly reports, which I read at the drafting table with a pencil and a ruler, marking figures the way I used to mark measurements. The company was healthy, revenue up, margins stable, the structural consulting market in Ohio experiencing a minor boom due to infrastructure spending. I read with professional interest and personal detachment. This was my company, but it had been running without me for 30 years, and I had no intention of disrupting what worked. Board chairs set direction. They don't carry load. One thing in the reports caught my eye. A billing discrepancy in the supply chain department, $180,000 outstanding for 3 months. The kind of error that happens when a vendor invoice is misrouted and someone catches it too late to fix it quietly. I knew the supply chain department was David's. I didn't know if David was aware of the error, but the report suggested it had been flagged internally and was under review. I could have called someone. I could have asked Arthur to look into it. Instead, I wrote a note in the margin of the report, approve correction, no personnel flag, and sent it back. If there was an error, it would be fixed. If David was responsible, it would be fixed without consequence. Not because he was my son, because the error was the kind that happens and the response should be proportionate to the problem, not to the person. That was Monday. By Tuesday, the correction was processed. Arthur sent a one-word text. Done. I went back to the garden. The zinnias were blooming now, orange and pink, and the deep red that looks almost burgundy in the late afternoon light. I cut a handful and put them in a mason jar on the kitchen table. Not with twine, just in water. Simple. In the evenings, I sat on the porch and watched the street. The neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do in late May: lawnmowers and children on bicycles and the smell of charcoal from someone's backyard. Eleanor waved from her porch on her way inside. I waved back. I did not call David. He did not call me. The voicemail from 2 weeks ago sat in my phone like a letter I'd read, but not answered. Present, acknowledged, waiting. Arthur texted on Friday. CEO confirmed June 3rd. I read the text twice. Then I went inside and watered the zinnias. David's voicemail was 37 seconds long. I know because I checked several times. Mom, I've been thinking about the dinner. Vanessa was... A pause. The kind of pause where you can hear someone deciding not to finish a sentence. I know it was a lot. Can we talk? I'd like to. I just want to talk. Call me back when you can. I listened to it the first time in the car, parked in my own driveway. The second time at the kitchen table. The third time sitting on the edge of my bed, in the dark, because some things are easier to hear when you can't see the room around you. 37 seconds. 12 of them were silence. David's voice in the message was the voice I remembered from when he was a teenager. Uncertain, reaching, trying to find the right word, and settling for something close. He had Richard's voice. Not the pitch, the cadence. The way Richard would start a sentence, stop, reconsider, start again. A history teacher's habit of revision. You say the thing, you hear how it sounds, you fix it. David was fixing in real time. And what he was fixing was 6 years of not fixing. I held the phone in my hand. My thumb was over the callback button. I could feel the glass under my fingertip. Smooth, warm, responsive. One press, and I would hear his voice in real time instead of recorded. One press, and we would have a conversation I wasn't ready for. Because what would I say? David, in 3 weeks, I'm going to be announced as the board chair of the company you work for. And then what? He would ask questions I wasn't prepared to answer while standing in the aftermath of a dinner neither of us had finished processing. The conversation would happen before the truth was visible. And a conversation without the full truth is a conversation with a load-bearing wall missing. It might stand, but it wouldn't be sound. I needed David to see the whole picture before we could talk about what happened inside it. This was not cruelty. I want to be clear about that. Cruelty is withholding to punish. What I was doing was withholding to prepare. The difference is timing. The difference is intent. The difference is that when we finally did talk, I wanted every piece of information on the table, not for my sake, but for his, so that he could respond to what was real, not to what he imagined. I set the phone on the nightstand, screen down. The voicemail notification glowed through the edge of the case, a small, persistent light that would be there when I woke up. I lay in the dark and thought about David at 12, checking measurements on the bridge report. his pencil moving down the column, his brow furrowed. The second check. He understood then. He understood that certainty required patience, and patience required trust in the process. I was trusting the process. The phone glowed on the nightstand. I closed my eyes and let the 37 seconds play again in my memory, not from the phone, just from the place where I kept his voice. I did not call back. June 2nd, the evening before. I laid my clothes on the bed, the way I used to lay blueprints on the drafting table. Flat, examined, each piece, considered for function before aesthetics. The navy suit was in the back of the closet, behind the cardigans and the fleece jackets, and the practical layers of a woman who had spent the last decade dressing for comfort rather than authority. I took it out and held it against myself in front of the mirror. The suit still fit. Not perfectly. I was 62, not 40, but it fit the way a well-designed structure fits its site, with accommodation, with allowance for the ground settling. The fabric was good. Wool blend, dark navy, single-breasted. I had bought it for a conference in 2009 and worn it exactly 4 times. Conferences, board meetings, Richard's funeral, occasions where you needed to be seen as something other than what you are every day. Tomorrow would be the 5th time. I opened the top drawer of the bureau, Richard's drawer, which I still thought of as Richard's drawer, even though it had been mine for 5 years. His cufflinks were in a small leather case in the back corner, silver, square, with a single line etched across each face. He'd worn them to school board meetings because he said they made him feel like someone who made decisions, not just someone who graded papers. I told him he made decisions every day. He said those didn't require cufflinks. I took one out, just one. The left one, the one he always put on first because he was left-handed and started with the easier side. I held it in my palm. It was cold. Silver is always cold until you hold it long enough. Then it takes your temperature and keeps it. I put the cufflink in the jacket pocket. Not to wear, it was a women's suit. There were no French cuffs, just to carry. The way I carried the letter. The way I carried everything that mattered. Close, silent, unforgotten. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at the woman looking back at me. Navy suit, grey hair, cut short, because I had never had patience for style. And short hair is the structural equivalent of clean design, minimal material, maximum function. No jewelry except the chain around my neck with Richard's wedding band. No makeup, because I didn't own any and didn't see the point of purchasing it for a single occasion. This woman was not the woman who had walked into David's house on Mother's Day. That woman had worn a Costco cardigan and carried banana bread and hoped quietly, desperately, that the evening would feel like home. This woman was not hoping. This woman was ready. And there is a difference between hoping and being ready that lives in the spine, not the face. Hope leans forward. Ready stands straight. I wasn't excited. Excitement is for outcomes you can't predict. I could predict this. I knew the structure. I knew the load paths. I knew what would hold and what would shift. What I couldn't predict was how it would feel. And that uncertainty was not fear. It was respect for the unknown. The same respect I brought to every inspection. You trust your calculations. You verify with reality. Tomorrow, I would verify. I turned off the bedroom light. The suit hung on the closet door, dark against the white paint, its shape like an outline, waiting to be filled. I didn't sleep well. I rarely did before an inspection. The mind runs its own checks in the dark, and you can't stop it. You can only lie there and let it work. June 3rd, 8:40 in the morning. I drove downtown. The drive from Bexley to Meridian's headquarters took 17 minutes. I had not made this drive in 30 years. Not since the company moved from Robert's garage to a small office on Neil Avenue, and then to the building on South High Street, where it now occupied 3 floors and employed people who had never heard my name. 17 minutes. The same drive I used to make every day when David was in preschool and Richard was teaching first period, and I was a structural engineer trying to build a company that mattered. The building was glass and steel, modern, the kind of building I might have inspected in my career but would never have designed. Too much glass, not enough redundancy. I parked in the visitor lot. The Subaru looked out of place between a BMW and a Tesla, which was fine. Looking out of place was something I had decades of practice with. Arthur was in the lobby. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen, charcoal, well-fitted, with the Mont Blanc pen visible in his breast pocket like a flag. He stood when he saw me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. 2 people who had been carrying this for 30 years, the weight of what I'd built and the patience of not speaking about it, standing in a lobby that existed because of decisions we'd made in a garage. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." He didn't say more. He pressed the elevator button. The elevator opened. We stepped in. The doors closed, and in the polished steel surface I saw myself. Navy suit, short grey hair, Richard's cufflink heavy in my jacket pocket. The woman in the reflection looked like someone who belonged here. I was still getting used to that. The boardroom was on the 3rd floor. Glass walls, a long mahogany table, 12 chairs. The chairs were leather, high-backed, the kind that swivel, and they were occupied. 11 people sat around the table. The CEO, Bradley Wells, was at the far end. He stood when I entered. He was younger than I expected, late 40s, salt and pepper hair, the build of a man who ran in the mornings. He extended his hand. "Mrs. Ellison, it's an honor." "Please, Margaret," he smiled. "Margaret, we've been looking forward to this." I shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief. Arthur pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the chair that had been empty, the chair that was written into the founding agreement as the co-founder's seat, the chair that had been waiting for 30 years for someone to sit in it. I sat down. The leather was cool. The table surface reflected the overhead lights in a long, clean line, like water in a channel. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany, one on each side of the folder Arthur had placed in front of me, and I looked down the length of the table. 12 faces. Some I recognized from reports. Most I didn't. They were looking at me the way you look at a structural element you didn't know was there, with recalibration, not alarm. Bradley spoke. "For those of you who don't know, and I understand most of you don't, Margaret Ellison co-founded this company in 1994 with Robert Chen. She has been our largest individual shareholder for 30 years. She has accepted the board chair position effective today." The room absorbed it. Some people nodded. One woman, CFO, I guessed, wrote something in a notebook. A man near the middle of the table shifted in his chair. No one spoke. The information was too large for small reactions. It needed time to settle, the way a new load needs time to distribute across a structure. I looked at the room. The glass walls showed the city beyond Columbus, laid out in buildings and bridges and roads, the infrastructure of a place I had helped build. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that my fingerprints were on the math that held this city upright, even if no one had ever looked at the blueprints. Bradley gestured to me. The floor was mine. I looked down the table. The chair at the far end, Bradley's chair, the operator's chair, was the only one that faced mine directly. Between us, the full length of the table, the full history of the company, the full weight of 30 years of silence. "Let's begin," I said. That was all. 2 words. The room waited for more, and when more didn't come, something shifted. Not in the room, in me. The weight I had been carrying redistributed. Not gone, just finally shared. The empty chair at the far end, Bradley's notes, the glass walls, and the city beyond. We began. That evening, Eleanor came to my house. I had invited her for dinner, a reversal that she accepted without comment, which was Eleanor's way of saying she understood the significance. I made soup, potato leek, from a recipe I'd been making since David was small. The kitchen smelled the way it smelled in the years when this house had 3 people in it, warm, starchy, thick with steam. I cracked the window above the sink to let the air circulate and watched Eleanor settle into the chair at the kitchen table, the chair Richard used to sit in, the chair that had been empty for 5 years. She didn't remark on this. Eleanor didn't remark on things that mattered. She just sat, and the fact of her sitting was the remark. I ladled the soup into bowls, the everyday bowls, not the china, because this was not a performance. This was Tuesday. This was 2 women eating soup and telling the truth about a day that had changed the shape of things. "Tell me," Eleanor said. The same words she always used. An opening, not a demand. The meeting went well. Bradley Wells is competent. The board is reasonable. They have questions, which they should. I sat down. The soup steamed between us. It felt correct, like putting a load back on a beam that was always rated for it. Eleanor nodded. She picked up her spoon. How did it feel? Not the engineering answer, the other one. I blew on my soup. The steam dispersed. It felt like being seen by people who'd never thought to look. Is that enough? I considered this. The soup was good, the potatoes had broken down the right amount, and the leeks still had texture. I had made this soup 100 times, and it was never exactly the same, which was the point. You follow the recipe. The ingredients do what they do. The result is always a version of what you intended, never the identical thing. It's a start, I said. Eleanor ate her soup. She didn't ask about David. She didn't ask about Vanessa. She didn't say, I'm proud of you, or you deserve this, or any of the things people say when they want to fill the silence with approval. She just ate her soup and looked out the window at the garden, where the zinnias were catching the last of the light. The zinnias look good this year, she said. They do. Richard would have overwatered them. He would have. We laughed. Small and warm. The kind of laugh that doesn't need to explain itself. The kind that only exists between people who have known each other long enough that the references don't require footnotes. We finished the soup. Eleanor helped me wash the dishes. She washed, I dried, an arrangement we'd settled into years ago without discussion. The kitchen was quiet, except for the water, and the clink of bowls, and the sound of Eleanor humming something tuneless that she probably didn't know she was humming. You look like yourself, she said, handing me the last bowl. I think I forgot who that was, I said. She dried her hands on the towel. She didn't disagree. She just looked at me with the steady, unimpressed expression of a woman who had waited 22 years for her neighbor to remember something she had never forgotten. Then she went home. I stood in the kitchen and felt the house settle around me, quiet, warm, mine. David didn't know yet. That was tomorrow's wait. Tonight was soup. 1 week later, the phone rang. Arthur called at 7 in the evening, unusual for him, because Arthur communicated in texts the way other people communicated in paragraphs. A phone call meant the information was either too complex or too human for a 1-sentence message. Hayden Group has initiated an internal review of their Meridian contract, he said. No greeting. Arthur didn't greet. He arrived at the point the way a train arrives at a station, on time, without ceremony. On what basis? Conflict of interest. Their VP of Business Development is the daughter-in-law of the new board chair of their largest structural subcontractor. It's a standard review. They'd be negligent not to do it. I sat at the kitchen table. The zinnias were in the mason jar. The evening light was turning them from orange to amber. I watched the color shift while Arthur spoke. The review itself won't find anything improper, he continued. There's nothing to find. You and Vanessa have never had a professional interaction. The contract predates your board appointment. The conflict is positional, not operational. But, Arthur paused. His pauses meant the same thing mine did. Space for the next thought to arrive fully formed. Hayden's board will want distance, standard risk mitigation. Vanessa will likely be moved from the Meridian relationship, possibly from business development entirely. Moved where? Internal operations. Lateral move. Same level, different scope. She keeps her title, her compensation. But the client-facing role, the one that put her on the VP track, goes to someone without the conflict. I held the phone against my ear and thought about Vanessa. Not the Vanessa from the dinner, the one who had stood in front of 40 people and redefined me as a burden. The other Vanessa, the one who had grown up with nothing and built a career on willpower and performance and the absolute conviction that she had done it alone. That Vanessa was about to discover that the structure she'd climbed through was connected to a woman she'd dismissed. I didn't feel satisfaction. I want to be precise about this because the audience deserves precision. Satisfaction implies that a desire has been fulfilled, and I had not desired this. I had desired to be known. The consequence for Vanessa was a byproduct of truth, not a goal. The architecture of her career had a flaw she didn't build and couldn't have known about. The flaw was me. Or rather, the flaw was my invisibility, which she had mistaken for absence. She wasn't fired, I said. No, she won't be. Hayden values her. They just can't have her managing a relationship that now has a personal dimension. Does she know why? She will by tomorrow. The announcement was internal at Meridian, but these things move through industries the way stress moves through structures. Someone at Hayden connected the name. I set the phone on the table. The zinnias, the light, the quiet house. I thought about Vanessa's speech. I decided that I was going to build my own foundation. She had meant it. I believe she had meant it. The tragedy was not that she had tried to be independent. The tragedy was that independence built on incomplete information is just a more dignified form of dependence. She had been standing on my foundation the whole time. She just didn't look down. Arthur was still on the line. I could hear him breathing, steady, patient, waiting. Thank you for telling me, I said. Margaret. Yes? This was always going to happen, once you accepted the position. You know that. I know. He hung up. I sat at the table for a long time. The zinnias turned from amber to shadow as the light left the room. I didn't turn on a lamp. Some things are easier to sit with in the dark. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the Mother's Day dinner, 18 days after I'd signed the papers in Arthur's office. Meridian held quarterly all-hands meetings in a conference space on the second floor. 200 employees, folding chairs, a podium, a projector screen. Bradley Wells ran them with the efficiency of a man who respected other people's time. I knew David would be there. Employee 187. Supply chain department. Third row, usually. Arthur had mentioned this in passing, the way Arthur mentioned everything, as if the information had arrived on its own, and he was simply forwarding it. I dressed that morning with the same care I dressed the day of the board meeting. Navy suit, Richard's cufflink in the pocket, chain with the wedding band under the collar. The mirror showed the same woman, the one who looked like she belonged. And I nodded at her, the way you nod at a colleague before a difficult inspection. Acknowledgement. Not confidence, just readiness. Bradley introduced me. He stood at the podium and said the words I had heard him say once before, in the boardroom, except now they were being said to 200 people, many of whom had worked at Meridian for years without knowing the name of the person who had helped create it. Margaret Ellison co-founded this company in 1994. She has been our largest individual shareholder for 30 years. She has accepted the board chair position, effective immediately. I stood. I walked to the podium. The room was a sea of faces, some curious, some neutral, one or two smiling politely. I scanned them the way I scan any structure, systematically, from left to right, top to bottom, looking for the element that matters most. Third row, left side, navy blue shirt, the same blue shirt, or one like it, with the collar that never sat right. David. He was looking at me the way you look at something that has suddenly changed shape. Not with anger, not yet with understanding. With the disorientation of a person who has walked into a familiar room and found the furniture rearranged. His mouth was slightly open. His hands were flat on his thighs, the way they used to be flat on the kitchen table when he was 12 and concentrating on measurements. Our eyes met. I held his gaze for 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough to say what couldn't be said from a podium in front of 200 people. I am who I am. I have always been this. I am sorry you are learning it here. Then I looked away. I looked at the room. I said what I had prepared, which was brief, my background, my commitment to the company, my respect for the team that had built what Robert and I had designed. I did not mention Robert's death or my retirement or the 30 years of silence. I spoke for 4 minutes. I was professional. I was precise. I was the woman in the navy suit who belonged at the podium, and I gave no one a reason to look at me and see anything other than competence. But in the third row, David's face was going through something I will never forget. Recognition. Yes, that's my mother. Confusion. She co-founded this. Shock. She's been here this whole time. And then something else. Something I couldn't name from the podium. Something that might have been grief or might have been the specific private vertigo of discovering that the ground you've been standing on was built by someone you thought was standing below you. He didn't speak to me after. The meeting ended. People filed out. Some came to shake my hand, a woman from accounting, a project manager with a firm grip and kind eyes, Bradley himself, who lingered to ask if I needed anything. I shook hands. I answered questions. I was present and accounted for. David was gone. He had left the room during the handshakes while I was speaking to someone whose name I immediately forgot. I saw the blue shirt moving toward the door. I saw him not look back. I stood at the podium after everyone had left. The folding chairs were empty. The projector screen was dark. The room smelled like coffee and the particular staleness of a space that had just held 200 people and now held 1. Arthur appeared in the doorway. He left, he said. I know. He'll come back. I didn't answer. I didn't know if Arthur was right. I didn't know if David would come back or what back would look like if he did. All I knew was that I had stood in front of my son and told the truth, not with words, but with presence, and his response was to leave. I picked up my folder from the podium. I straightened the chair at the front of the room. I turned off the projector. Then I drove home and waited. The knock came at 7:18. I know the time because I looked at the kitchen clock when I heard it. Reflex, the same reflex that makes you note the time when a structure shifts. You record. You timestamp. You create a record of when things changed. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I'd made at 6 and hadn't finished. The tea was cold. The kitchen was dark, except for the light above the stove, the small light, the one I kept on at night because the kitchen shouldn't be fully dark. A house with no light is a house with no one in it. And I was still here. I opened the door. David was on the porch. He was still wearing the blue shirt from the meeting, but it was untucked now and his tie was gone. And he looked hollowed. That's the only word. Hollowed, like a structure that has had its interior load removed. The shell standing, the inside empty. "How long?" he said. "Since before you were born." He looked at me. I looked at him. The porch light was on. Mine was not brass, not 22 years old, but it worked, and it showed me his face in the warm, unforgiving detail that porch lights specialize in. He looked like Richard. Not the way he usually looked like Richard, in the shoulders and the cadence and the way he held a fork. He looked like Richard on the day Richard told me he was sick, the same devastation wearing the same face. "Come in," I said. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table, in the chair opposite mine, the chair that had been empty for different reasons across different years. I put the kettle on, not because tea would fix anything, but because the act of making tea is a form of hospitality that doesn't require you to know what to say. And I didn't know what to say. I made 2 cups. I set one in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it, the way you wrap your hands around something warm when the rest of you is cold. "Did Dad know?" His voice was quiet, not accusatory, searching. He helped Robert and me pick the name. Meridian. He said it sounded like something that would last. David's eyes filled. Not tears, not yet. Just the brightness that comes before tears, the surface tension that holds until it doesn't. He looked down at his tea. "Why didn't you tell me?" I sat across from him and held my own cup. The kitchen was quiet. The stove light hummed. The faucet, my faucet, dripped once. I had never fixed it. I had never fixed it because fixing it felt like fixing Eleanor's. And Eleanor's was its own thing. "The company was never about you," I said. And I could hear how that sounded, harsh, cold, the wrong thing. So I continued. "I mean, it was never about the family. It was about the work. Robert and I built it because we were good at it. And when you came, I stepped back because you were more important. But the company wasn't a gift I was keeping from you. It was a part of my life that existed separately. The way your father's teaching was his, not mine. But I worked there. You were hired through normal channels. Your position is merit-based. Arthur documented it before the announcement. You planned this. I planned to protect you, yes." He drank his tea. I drank mine. The kitchen clock ticked. The stove light held. 2 people sitting at a table in a house in Bexley, drinking tea and trying to rebuild something that had never been built correctly in the first place. He didn't ask about the dinner. He didn't mention Vanessa's speech. He didn't say, "I'm sorry I sat there and said nothing while my wife dismantled you in front of 40 people. And I didn't bring it up. Because this conversation, the first real conversation David and I had had in years, was not about the dinner. It was about his father, about the name of a company, about a boy who checked measurements and a man who forgot to check, and a woman who built things and stepped away and was invisible and chose to be visible and was sitting here, now, in a kitchen that smelled like tea and sounded like a clock. "Tell me about the bridge measurements," he said. And his voice cracked on the word measurements, the way concrete cracks when it finally yields, not all at once, just a small release that signals the beginning of something larger. So I told him. I told him about the bridge report when he was 12. I told him about his father bringing sandwiches to the garage. I told him about the morning I printed the letter and put it in my cardigan pocket and drove to a dinner that destroyed everything and created everything. We talked until midnight. I made more tea. When he left, he stood in the doorway for a moment. He didn't hug me. He wasn't ready. But he looked at me, really looked. Not the airport wave, not the kitchen passing glance, and he said, "I'll come back." "I know," I said. I didn't know. But I said it anyway, because some things you say, not because they're too. David left at midnight. I locked the door behind him, gently, the way you close something that needs closing but doesn't need to hear it. I cleaned the kitchen, 2 teacups, a spoon, the kettle. Small artifacts of a conversation that had covered 30 years in 6 hours. I washed them by hand. I had a dishwasher. But dishwashers are for volume. And this was not volume. This was 2 cups. David's cup was the blue one with the hairline crack at the rim that I'd never thrown away because the crack didn't affect the function. I washed it and set it on the drying rack. I didn't put it in the cabinet. I don't know why. It felt right to let it sit there, visible, drying in the air of the kitchen where he'd been. I wiped the table. The surface was warm where his hands had been, or I imagined it was, which is the same thing when you're alone at midnight and your son has just left and the house is returning to its shape around you. I thought about everything I didn't say. I didn't mention the billing error. I knew about it, the $180,000 discrepancy in his department, flagged in the quarterly report, corrected with a margin note that protected his name. I knew, and he probably suspected I knew, and we had both chosen not to speak about it. Some silences are avoidance. Others are mercy. I didn't ask about Vanessa. I didn't say her name. I didn't ask if she knew yet about the Hayden review, or if she understood the connection, or if she had felt the ground shift the way David had felt it. That was their conversation to have, their architecture to inspect. I had been inside their house uninvited once, according to Vanessa, many times, and I would not enter it again. Not the house, not the marriage, not the space between them that I had never understood and might not be designed to. I didn't bring up the dinner, the speech, the 40 faces, the walk to the door. I carried those things the way I carried the cufflink and the wedding band and the letter, close, present, part of the inventory. But this conversation was not about what I deserved. It was about what David needed. And what David needed was to sit in his mother's kitchen and ask about his father and hear the truth and drink tea and leave when he was ready. Margaret's deepest act of love. Restraint. I understand how that sounds. I understand that some people will hear this and think I was weak, that I should have demanded an apology, should have made him reckon with what he'd allowed to happen. But I am a structural engineer, and I know this. Sometimes the strongest move is removing load, not adding it. David walked into my house carrying the weight of everything he'd just learned. If I had added the weight of what he owed me, the structure wouldn't have held. He would have buckled. The conversation would have become a confrontation, and the confrontation would have ended with another door closing. I chose not to close the door. I turned off the stove light. The kitchen went dark, except for the thin blue glow of the clock on the microwave. 12:07. Wednesday now. The teacup sat on the drying rack. Blue, cracked, functional. I left it there. I went to bed and slept better than I had since Mother's Day. Not well, but better. David came on a Sunday, the first Sunday of June, 3 weeks after the all-hands meeting. He called first, not a voicemail this time, but a real call, the kind where you hear the other person breathe before they speak. "Mom, can I come over?" "Of course." He arrived at 2. He brought bread from a bakery I didn't know, sourdough still warm, wrapped in paper that smelled like yeast and wheat. He held it out the way you hold out something you've chosen carefully. I took it. We sat at the kitchen table. I made tea. He ate bread with butter. We talked about the weather, which was warm for June. We talked about the garden, which was producing more tomatoes than I could eat. He offered to take some home. I bagged them in a paper sack. We did not talk about Vanessa. We did not talk about Meridian. Except once, I asked how work was, and he said, fine, and I said, good, and we let it rest. There was an understanding between us that was new and fragile, like fresh concrete that hadn't cured. You don't test it. You don't put load on it. You let it set. He asked about his father. This was becoming a pattern, each visit. A new question about Richard. Not the big questions, not yet. Small ones. Did Dad really tune his guitar to the refrigerator? Yes. Did he like sourdough? He liked everything with butter. Was he proud of the company? Of what you built? I thought about this. He was proud of me, I said. The company was part of that, but it wasn't the whole thing. He was proud of me the way he was proud of a good paragraph, because the work was honest. David nodded. He buttered more bread. The kitchen smelled like sourdough and tea, and the afternoon light came through the window and landed on the table in a rectangle that moved imperceptibly as the minutes passed. He came the first Sunday of July and August and September. Each visit was a little longer, an hour, then were two. Then he stayed for dinner. Once, I made the potato leek soup, and he said it tasted the way he remembered, which was the first time he'd acknowledged remembering anything from the kitchen at all. We didn't rebuild the relationship we'd had. That relationship had been built on incomplete information and good intentions, and the kind of love that confuses sacrifice with silence. It was a structure that couldn't hold because neither of us had checked the measurements. What we built instead was different, smaller, more honest. A monthly Sunday in a kitchen in Bexley with tea and bread and questions about a man we both loved and lost. No pretense, no performance, no 40-place settings, and no china, and no speeches about independence. Just two people sitting across from each other, doing the slow, careful work of learning who the other person actually was. It was less than I had imagined. The family dinners, the holidays, the grandmother role, I had imagined all of it. In the years after Richard died, in the quiet of this house, I had imagined being at the center of a family that needed me. What I had instead was a monthly Sunday, and sourdough from a bakery I didn't know, and a son who was learning to look me in the eye. It was less than I imagined. It was more than I had. I set two places at the table every first Sunday. The second place was always filled. October. The drafting table. I had been sitting at it for 3 hours, and the light through the window had shifted from morning bright to the softer angle of mid-afternoon, the kind of light that makes graph paper easier to read and pencil lines easier to trust. The plans were spread across the oak surface, a community bridge project pro bono for a town council member Eleanor knew. A small bridge, 2 spans. Nothing fancy. The kind of project Robert and I would have taken in 1994 because it was honest work, and honest work was how you built a reputation. The bridge would cross a creek in a neighborhood park on the east side of Columbus, pedestrian only. Steel beams on concrete abutments, a simple deck, handrails. The kind of bridge children would cross on their way to school and adults would cross without noticing. The kind of bridge that mattered precisely because no one would think about it. That was the job, to build things so well that they disappeared into the landscape of ordinary life. I checked the measurements, span length, load rating, soil conditions from the geotechnical report the town council had commissioned. I checked them twice. The second check is not because you got it wrong, it's because the stakes are high enough to be certain. My father said this first. Not in those words, he was a carpenter, not an engineer, and his version was something about measuring twice and cutting once, which is the same principle wearing a different trade's clothes. I formalized it. I taught it to David. David taught it to no one, as far as I knew, but he might yet. He might yet. I picked up the pencil and began the structural calculations. Dead load. The weight of the bridge itself. Live load. The people who would cross it. Environmental load. Wind, snow, the slow expansion and contraction of steel across Ohio's seasons. Each number was a fact. Each calculation was a promise. If I did the math correctly, the bridge would hold. If I did it incorrectly, someone would fall. The stakes were real, and the reality of the stakes was what made the work worth doing. I was not happy. I want to be honest about that. Because this story is not a story about happiness. It's a story about a woman who built things and was invisible and chose to be visible and bore the cost of visibility, which is that you can never go back to being unseen. Vanessa knew who I was now. David knew. The industry knew. The banana bread and the cardigan and the Subaru were still part of me. I wore the cardigan while I drew the bridge plans because it was October and the house was cool. But they were no longer all of me. I was larger than my disguise. That was freedom. And freedom is not the same as happiness. Freedom is the absence of pretense. Happiness is something else, something I might have later or might not. And the uncertainty was fine. What I felt, sitting at the drafting table with the pencil and the plans and the October light, was calibration. The sense of all the parts of my life, the engineer, the mother, the widow, the co-founder, the board chair, the neighbor, the woman who bakes banana bread for people who don't see her, finally in alignment. Not perfect alignment. Not the way a new bridge is aligned, clean and precise. More like the way an old house is aligned, settled, adjusted, honest about its age and its history and the weight it has carried. I finished the calculations. I rolled up the plans. I set the pencil on the table, the same table Richard gave me, the same surface I'd worked on for 22 years, and I stood. The kitchen was quiet. The garden outside was browning, October in Ohio, everything pulling back, preparing for the weight of winter. The zinnias were done. I would plant new ones in the spring. I washed my hands and started dinner. Wednesday coffee with Eleanor. The kitchen, the mugs, blue for me, green for her, the faucet that still dripped because she still liked the company. Eleanor had made the coffee strong, the way she always did, because Eleanor believed that weak coffee was a moral failure, and I had never disagreed. We sat at the table. The morning light was thin, October, overcast, the kind of day that makes kitchens feel warmer by contrast. "How's the bridge?" Eleanor asked. "Coming along. 2 spans, steel beams on concrete abutments, pedestrian. The soil report came back clean, so the foundation should be straightforward." Eleanor nodded, her expression patient and mildly interested in the way of a person who does not know what abutments are, but respects the person describing them. "And the calculations?" "Checked twice." "As one does," I smiled. Eleanor sipped her coffee and looked out the window. Her backyard was small and orderly, a pruned rosebush, a bird feeder, a fence that needed painting. She would paint it in the spring. She always painted it in the spring. "David called yesterday," I said. "How was that?" "Good. He asked about the bridge project. Said it sounded interesting." I paused. He's never asked about my work before. Not since he was 12. I let Eleanor set her mug down. People change. People don't change. They just stop hiding parts of themselves. Or they start seeing parts of other people they'd been ignoring. That sounds like something that belongs on a motivational poster. Please don't. We laughed. Small, easy, the kind of laugh that exists between people who don't need it to mean anything more than what it is. A Wednesday morning, coffee, a kitchen that had held 1,000 of these mornings and would hold 1,000 more. You look like yourself, Eleanor said. She had said this before, the night of the soup, the night after the board meeting, but it sounded different now, less like a diagnosis and more like a greeting. I think I forgot who that was, I said. I had also said this before. No, Eleanor said. You didn't forget. You just stopped introducing yourself. The faucet dripped. The coffee steamed. The morning held. I thought about all the Wednesdays that had come before this one, all the kitchens and the coffees, and the conversations that never mentioned Meridian because there was nothing to mention, and then the Wednesdays after the dinner when there was everything to mention and we mentioned only what mattered. Eleanor had never asked for the full story. She had the pieces she needed and she assembled them the way she assembled everything, quietly, completely, without needing to display the finished picture. More coffee? She asked. Please. She poured. The mug was warm. The kitchen was warm. The morning was what mornings are, when you've come through something and arrived on the other side. Not better exactly, but present. Fully, honestly, present. I drank my coffee and stayed. I drove home from Eleanor's in the Subaru. The dent in the rear bumper was still there. I'd never fixed it, because fixing it felt like admitting the car was old and the car was not old. The car was experienced. There's a difference. The route from Eleanor's house to mine was 3 blocks. I knew every house on the way. The Hendersons, who had painted their shutters blue last spring. The Kellers, who had a dog that barked at everything except me. The empty lot on the corner where a house had been demolished 2 years ago and nothing had been built yet, just a square of grass and a for sale sign that the weather had bleached to near invisibility. I passed David's neighborhood on the way, not his house, the neighborhood, the turnoff for the road that led to Dublin. I didn't turn in, there was no reason to. He would come to me on Sunday, the first Sunday, the way he'd been coming since June. And we would sit at the table and drink tea and he would ask about his father and I would answer. And the space between us would be a little smaller each time, the way the space between measurements narrows when you calibrate the instrument. I pulled into my driveway. The house was the same. The garden was pulling back for winter. The tomato cages empty. The zinnias gone. The beds covered in mulch I'd laid last week. The porch light was on. I always left it on during the day in October because the days were shorter and I didn't like coming home to dark. I went inside. I hung up my jacket. I sat on the porch for a while because the afternoon was cool but not cold, and the light was the kind that makes you want to watch it until it's gone. I took out a small notebook from the basket by the door, the kind I used to carry on site inspections, pocket-sized, spiral-bound, with a cover that had been softened by years of use. I opened it to a blank page. I picked up the pencil I kept with it, a mechanical pencil, 0.7mm lead, the kind that doesn't need sharpening because the precision is built in. I wrote a single line. I won't tell you what it was. Some things belong to the person who writes them and the page that holds them. I closed the notebook. I set it on the arm of the porch chair. The sun was going down over Bexley, low and orange, the kind of sunset that looks like it was designed by someone who understood color theory. The houses on the street were lighting up, one by one, the way structures take load, gradually, reliably, each one bearing its own weight. She built everything they stood on. They never looked down, but she was never beneath them. She was the foundation. And foundations don't look up, they hold. I picked up the notebook. I went inside. I had a bridge to finish. Was David wrong to stay silent? Was he weak or was he afraid? Or is that the same thing? What would you have done sitting in that chair with your mother 12 feet away and your wife at the podium? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, if Margaret's voice is still in your head, subscribe. There are more stories to tell. Not all of them end like this one, but the ones that matter never end the way you expect.